Hi, it's Jeff at Slavens Racing. This video is about how to measure ring end gap. And this is a KTM 300 cylinder I have here. So first you peel the ring off the piston and stick it in the cylinder. I should back up a little bit. So what is ring end gap? That's the gap here. It's the end of the ring. So the ring end gap. And I just set it in there at the very top, and then I use the piston because it's got this much distance. I've got one ring here as a stopper, and I push it down until it hits the ring. Call it good. So now it's down there about maybe 10 millimeters. And the only tools you need are some feeler gauges. You can use regular feeler gauges, or I have these spark plug feeler gauges that I use just because I like the feel of them. They're smaller. And measurements are all about feel. You've got to kind of develop a feel. So we're measuring this gap in here, not the wide place here where the pin sits, but the smallest gap. And this is a 12 thousandths feeler gauge, and it goes right through there. And I checked this earlier, and it's actually 14, so I would go up one size at a time on this until I had some drag as I pulled the gauge through there. You don't want to force it in, but it needs to have some drag to it. So we measure ring end gap primarily when for two reasons actually. You can measure your old rings just to see if they're worn out. So if you put them in there, do the measurement, you've got a big gap, we'll say 25 thousandths or something. That would be an indicator that the rings are worn out and or the cylinder's worn out. So, but if you have an old cylinder, say a cylinder with 150 hours on it, and you've got a new set of rings, and you put them in there and do the measurement, and you still have a big gap, well then that would indicate that the cylinder bore is worn out, or at least has a lot of wear to it. So, as I showed in a previous video about the lip up here, if there happens to be a lip right up here at the very top, that's an indicator that you have a lot of wear, and your measurement's going to be taken below that lip, where the ring travels up and down during its stroke. And that's why you're going to get a big gap if you have a lot of wear there. I don't ever take that measurement. I can pull an engine apart and within seconds tell you if it needs, the condition of the cylinder and the rings. I only use the ring end gap measurement when I'm installing new rings in a fairly good condition cylinder, because I want to make sure that they're not too tight. If the end gap is too tight, I didn't look up the specs on this cylinder, but on 250 or 300 it's probably 12 to 14 thousandths end gap. And so if it would be less than that, say if it was 10, well, it could cause the ring to scuff and score the cylinder, or it could possibly even cause a seizure. So if it was too tight, I would take a jeweler's file like this, and I would just dress the end of it very carefully and take just a little off of it, and then I'd put it back in, and I would measure it again. Now, in the old days when we had a cast iron liner, this is a nickel cell coated cylinder, and we had a cast iron liner, and they were borable, so you had 4 different size pistons that you could buy to bore them larger. Well, each set of rings was larger, and you could buy larger rings. You could buy an oversized set of rings, and then file them down to get the tolerances that you want. And if for doing something like that, you would mount the file in a vise and then run the ring across it carefully, and it just makes it a little bit easier to do that way. But you're probably never going to have to use that. And most of the time you're never going to have to use a file at all on a set of rings. From when you buy them, you can usually just stick them in, and they're fine. So say if you had your engine apart for maybe a water leak or something, and the engine didn't have that many miles on it, you thought maybe you could possibly reuse the rings, and you measured them and they spec out all right. Well, now you can see that the rings look different on each side. And on brand new rings there's usually a letter stamped on them, and that's up. But on these rings, that letter's been worn off, so you can't really tell. So you got a shiny side, and then you've got kind of a black side, kind of a splotchy side. So the shiny side is always the bottom side. And the reason that is the compression, as the piston's coming up, it's pushing the ring down. So it's putting all the pressure on the bottom side of that ring, and it makes it shiny. So that's the bottom side of the ring. Now there's a million other little tricks that you can do for 4 strokes and even for 2 strokes, but most of them, it's like surfacing the rings, or, yeah, I'm not even going down that road, but there's a lot of little things that you can do for setup on rings that are totally almost a waste of time. I mean, I've done them over the years, and I don't do anything anymore except for put them on the piston and install them, because everything is really good these days. And years past, tolerances were not as tight, manufacturing tolerances, and so you had to really go through everything with a fine-tooth comb to build a really nice race motor. These days it's much easier, and especially if you're just building a motor for trail riding, you don't need to get too carried away about it. So I think that's about all there is to tell you about ring end gap. That's all for now.